video is covered by fair use.
Hi and welcome to another episode of Stupid Slayer. I haven't done one of these in a really long time. That's because it's really fucking hard work doing all that editing and stuff, especially since I don't know what I'm doing with it. So rather than breaking down other people's videos, I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to talk about something that's happened in, my country this week, which is the attack on the Muslims outside the mosque in Finsbury Park in London. Now, if you're not familiar with this, I'll just fill you in quickly. What happened was there was a guy from Wales. I'm not going to mention his name or anything in there because these people just want this sort of stuff, so I'm not going to abide them with it. What he did is he rented a van, he drove it to London, and he went to Finsbury Park. Now, we'll talk a bit more about Finsbury Park Mosque in a little while, but he spotted a group of Muslims who, it turns out, were helping an old man who'd collapsed in the street. And he decided that the best thing he could do to address this problem of radicalised Muslims doing this sort of shit in our country was to give them a taste of their own fucking medicine. Now, that's not my view, I'm just telling you what I think he would have thought. And he decided that what he'd do is he'd drive at speed into this group of people who were trying to help somebody and mow them all down. Now, there was only one people killed. I believe it was the old man who was... we don't know whether it was the van or whether he was already dying, to be honest, at this point. So, from that respect, it was quite lucky there wasn't a lot more fatalities. I mean, a speeding vehicle into human bodies is something that can end badly for the human bodies. Unfortunately, this is not something that's a great surprise to me. It's been something that I've almost been expecting to happen for quite a long time. Now, Britain isn't the same place as France, where the people seem to have been very cowed by this sort of experiences. And the nature of the British people is that they're going to fight back against things that they deem to be unfair against them. The problem has been that apologies far too often are being made for the people who have done these things, that the blame is being put onto the people who have had them done against them. I mean, look, the Charlie Hebdo thing in France, within hours we had people on the news saying, or at least connotating, that it was their own fault because they were racists, and all of that sort of rhetoric that's thrown around within Europe. Europe itself has got a very big problem with the difference in opinions and views of the ruling class and the actual majority of people that live there. And I can see it being a huge problem in the future, but it's not something I really want to go into at the minute. Now, this guy, we've had it raised in the news that he's apparently had mental health problems. Members of his family have said now what that is unclear. I mean, if the guy's just taking some depression tablets and that sort of thing, it's we would class that as mental health over here. And clearly not something that would lead you to be doing something like this. It's the guy's an idiot. He's obviously, from the comments that he made, apparently when he was taken out of the van, that he wanted to kill Muslims and he'd done his bit. He's obviously a very misguided human being if he thinks this sort of thing's going to actually help as opposed to just inflame things. The reason, of course, it's significant in what he actually did is because in the case of 2 of the 3 terror attacks that we've had in this country in recent months, perpetrated by Islamists against the British public, this has been the almost exact way that they've committed their atrocities. They've rented vehicles, they've driven them into crowds of people. In the Islamists' case, they then jumped from the vehicles with knives and continued to attack people. One of them, it was a police officer very close to the Houses of Parliament, so we don't know what he actually intended to do further. The second case, the police dealt with very, very quickly. The difference, of course, being that this guy's not dead and all of them are. The reason this guy's not dead is that he was actually restrained at the scene by a group of people from the mosque who apparently abused him quite seriously at the time, kicking him and punching him. Some people would say that was to be expected. The imam of the mosque has been praised in the press here for calming the situation and telling them to stop doing it and to wait until the police arrived, which is what eventually happened and the guy was arrested. Of course, the other reason that he's not dead is that he didn't appear to have that as part of his plan, whereas these Islamists do. Now, he doesn't have his virgins in heaven waiting for him by his ideological beliefs. I don't think he's a Muslim, at least. I'm doubting it. And this appears to be what guides these guys down the road of just continuing until they're killed. Now, going back to what happened to the guy when he was beaten up by the crowd, when we had the second attack with the van and the guys stabbing people, there was a gentleman who apparently fought 3 of these attackers and was quite badly injured and stabbed in the neck. He was portrayed in the press as being a football hooligan, and there was some talk in some places that he should actually be charged with assaulting these people and getting involved, and he shouldn't have done. He was a Millwall football fan. That people that don't know, Millwall is a football team in this country that's famous for having football thugs in the 80s and the early 90s. I'm not sure whether this guy actually was a football hooligan or what, but the tone in the press that these people were justified in attacking this guy and how good it was that the imam had come out and stopped them doing it is a contrast to how the gentleman was portrayed in the press. And I think this is part of the problem which has caused this incident to happen, and also which will perpetuate it in the future. It's the double standard that people feel, at least, is being put upon them, where it was almost unmentioned in the press here that this was somebody committing a revenge attack, in his eyes, against these attacks that had been that had taken place, where he was completely at blame, obviously. But as I said, that's not always the way it's portrayed in the press when it's the other way round. Another thing which was stark contrast to what happens when there is Islamist attacks in this country was the speed in which it was reported and in fact classified officially as a terrorist attack. It apparently took the police 8 minutes to classify it as a terror attack, whereas we see these very long delays and people unwilling to call it a terror attack when the Islamists actually do it here, and unwilling to identify them as Islamists or as Muslims. I mean, I don't want to cast this aspersion on all Muslims. It's not anything to do with all Muslims. It's this particular brand of Wahhabism, which is the type of Islam which is practiced in places like Saudi Arabia, which teaches a very violent and a very extreme version of Islam. It's the type of Islam which teaches about conquering other countries and about cowing the people that live there, and about these taxes that you should pay if you're not a Muslim and you want to live there. Of course, only if you're a person of the book, everybody else should get killed. All of this sort of thing. This is what the problem is. And for some reason, these people seem to find it quite attractive. Why, you'd have to ask them if you can find one that's alive for long enough. The press will even use quite weaselly tactics to try and divert from who has actually committed these attacks. They'll say things like, whatever the guy's name is, resident of a town in England, and try to make out that his ethnic background or his religious background is nothing to do with what has actually happened, and it's not a relevant point that they need to tell people. I mean, the glee almost that they reported that the guy that bombed the arena in Manchester was born in this country was quite sickening. And again, in that attack, we had I think he's the vice mayor or something like that, of Manchester, come out immediately afterwards and give this big long speech about what happened. And about the second sentence in this speech was, that you can't blame the Muslim community for it. And I just think that the British public as a whole don't take that sort of thing very well. It's disrespectful to the people who have died. I mean, especially when it's young children and girls and things that have been blown up at a pop concert. And the second thing you want to worry about, the second sentence from your mouth, is that you can't blame the people that have are the community that this person comes from for this attack, instead of paying a bit more deference to the people who have lost their lives meaninglessly, who probably didn't even know this sort of thing existed and certainly probably didn't have an opinion about it or anything else. It's not something that young girls think about. In fact, he went further than saying that you couldn't blame these people. He made a point of stating that there would be harsh punishment and retribution taken against anybody who did anything against their community. And again, it is wrong to take any action against people who probably had no more to do with it than the people that died that day. But they're not that high up the list of what you should be worried about at that time in a speech as a politician who is talking about what's happened. It just seemed indelicate, wrong, contrived. I don't know how to explain it. It just seemed like it wasn't the right point in that speech, 2 sentences in, to be talking about reprisals against people when young kids had died. We have this almost routine that happens in this country when we have Islamic terror attacks, that we immediately start making excuses. You hear the sentences come out of mouths on the news over and over again. It's nothing to do with Islam. It's not Muslims. It's not all Muslims. Whichever of these narratives we get, it's almost within minutes of these things happening that we start making excuses for the people that have done it, and that we refuse to accept that there is something in the ideology that they follow that leads them to commit these sort of attacks. And it's ridiculous to try and say that it's nothing to do with Islam. It may be nothing to do with certain sects of Islam, but it certainly is something to do with at least one sect of Islam, in particular the one that is prescribed to by ISIS. I mean, they call themselves the Islamic State. Whether some other Muslims consider them to be Muslims or not, they certainly consider themselves to be Muslims. And it is certainly the teachings in the Quran and the Hadiths that they are following, whether they are interpreting the wrong side, which I just think is ridiculous that religious people say that their texts need to be interpreted. The idea that an all-powerful being wouldn't just say what he meant is just a bit stupid. But you know, that they are certainly able to take from the texts written down enough justification for what they're doing to kill themselves. You've got to think there's got to be quite a lot of justification there that they can at least perceive before somebody gives up their life in the name of something. But there's an utter, what some people would call unwillingness from the powers that be to accept this. I don't think there's an unwillingness from them personally. I think they're deceitful. I think that they've got themselves into a situation they don't really know how to get out of, and they don't want to take the blame for it. They make excuses. They say that these things aren't anything to do with the doctrines of this religion, that the people that are killing themselves for it say that there is. And it's now becoming very apparent to people that these double standards are being applied, and it's going to lead to more of this sort of stuff. And the media and the governments around Europe and in Britain have got to realise this, and they've got to start addressing it honestly. Now, I'm not saying that it's down to the Muslim community to deal with it. We're all British people in this country, and we need to deal with it as one community. The underlying issue to it all has been this idea of multiculturalism, which has been the biggest failure ever. The idea that you would have all of these cultures just exist under one thing together has just created this ghettoized country. London being like this little microcosm of it, where British people are now the minority there. It just hasn't worked. what a society needs to maintain itself is to be able to take immigrants in and take the best from their cultures and integrate it with the best from their own cultures and take on the good things and discard the bad things and all grow together. And that isn't what has happened here, and it's not been what has been the aspiration for people to happen here. It's not what the idea of multiculturalism has been, and it seems pretty obvious that it was never going to work as it was actually designed to. It was silliness from the start. I mean, you've got the Afro-Caribbeans here that came to this country in the 50s and the 60s because they literally couldn't get the British people to do some of the more menial jobs. So they brought in people from what was then the Commonwealth to come and do these jobs, which they happily came to do because their lives were better in this country and that they had more chances to get themselves from that level of doing the menial jobs, and their children could aspire to better things. And I mean, you speak to that particular part of our community, and they're more British than I am. Some of them, it's ridiculous. But we've made Britishness, and particularly in England, Englishness, something to be ashamed of. It's almost as if it's racist to be British. And so, in short, I think that what we need to do to combat this problem is we've got to come together as one British people. I mean, the way we even describe ourselves, you have the indigenous population, I suppose, that would consider themselves to be English, British, whichever they choose to use, of which I've heard silly arguments about that doesn't exist because we've always had new people coming to this country, the Romans, the Normans, all of this sort of thing. Well, Britain and England didn't exist in that time either. We had little feudal kingdoms all over the place, Wessex and Mercia and all of these sort of things. And so it's just a stupid argument. I mean, England is a fairly recent in the overall history of this island idea. Britain, an even more recent idea. So to say that there's no such thing as Britishness and Englishness is stupid. I suppose that some of the SJWs out there would call that the white people. But you hear people describe themselves as they're from the Pakistani community, or they're from the Muslim community, or they're from the Afro-Caribbean community. I don't even particularly like the way that the Americans do it, where they would call themselves African Americans and Italian Americans and German Americans. That they are just Americans. I mean, they're much more integrated from these hundreds of different cultures that came together at the time that America was built than we are here. But that's because they tried to integrate. Here, that wasn't the idea. We wanted to have this multicultural system where we'd have this one island with this utopia where all these different cultures and ideas would just be able to exist next to each other. And I mean, your culture and your beliefs and the way that your society is structured is to do with the laws and the political systems, and it just was a stupid idea that was never going to work. And I think we all need to just get away from this idea, and we need to think more in a way that we all live on this island. We've got to exist together if we're going to be here. If we don't want to be here and we don't like the way it is, then without what people shouting race at me, go somewhere else. You know, if you want to be a Pakistani, then live in Pakistan, because that's where Pakistani people live. If you want to be British and you want to take on all of the good parts of being British and our society and the freedoms that you can have here, then be British. Don't be Pakistani, or don't be Afro-Caribbean. Don't be even like Scottish and Irish. Again, I don't understand it. It's just silliness. We've been one country for hundreds of years. So why people still consider themselves to be Scottish or Welsh or Irish or English? I mean, my parents were both born in England. I was born in Germany because my father served in the forces. My passport says British. It doesn't say English. It doesn't say Scottish. It doesn't say Welsh. It says British. As does everybody else's. So, I don't know, that's an arbitrary thing to put it down to what it says on our passports, but we all need to start acting that way, and we need to combat this problem from that point of view. We need to look at why these people are doing these things and what it is that they're trying to achieve, and agree that that is or isn't what we want in this country. I mean, these people are trying to achieve a worldwide caliphate. They want the world to be run under Sharia law. I don't want to live in a world or a country that's run by Sharia law personally, or Christian law for that fact. And I think we need to be able to criticise and say things that make other people uncomfortable, even though they make people uncomfortable, so that we can debate them, we can talk about them, we can come to a consensus of how we feel as a people and what we need to do to go forwards to make it better and to stop what's often these young kids or young adults being radicalised online, a lot of it. I mean, it's madness. Parents need to be taking responsibility for what their kids are doing online. We need to know what they're looking at and what they're seeing. We need to be more savvy about the tech ourselves. The kids, unfortunately, know more about it than we're ever going to understand at this point. But we need to employ the technology that we're allowing them to use in a way that is safe for them to use, that we can guide them in the right direction, because that's our jobs as parents, and that's where we need to be heading with it. With all of these things, if we can get it out of the younger generation, it will naturally dissipate. The younger generation are the new ideas that are going to come forwards, and if we can take these ideas of the differences between different parts of our community away from the youngsters, then it will just, the next generation won't think about them and these things won't be there. But they are here at the moment. We need to make sure that we stop them. We need to make sure that it's done in a way that the government isn't intruding into the lives of everybody in the country and everything they do, like Theresa May and her cohorts have decided to do this week. We need to be united against it. And I know it sounds like a cliche, and it is like the thing that's trotted out after we have these attacks where, you know, we won't be broken down and all this sort of thing. Well, we blatantly are broken down because we allow our governments to look into our personal lives more than we ever would have done before this war on terror that was started by George Bush and Tony Blair. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to know what other people think about this. I'd like to your opinions on it. I hope it's not just too boring staring at a static cartoon. If it is, then let me know. I'll see if I can edit in perhaps some of the news reports that have been about what I'm talking about. And I know I said at the beginning of this we were going to talk about this attack, and I suppose what I really meant is why this attack had happened and what we need to do to stop this attack, these sorts of attacks, and from the other side. And I'm using air quotes so you can't see me, but we need it not to be the other side. We need to address it as one people.
What are you doing in a baseball bat? I can't get you. Why are you doing that?